Thanks, Greg. When there's a surplus of anything, it tends not to be valued as much. Perhaps the reason why we are beginning not to value freedom very much is because we probably had a lot in this country. But freedom is under threat, and I want to talk a little bit about that. Now, freedom of speech is an inseparable part of freedom. So first we must understand what freedom is and where freedom sits now, and identify some threats in general to freedom. So that's what I want to do today. Now, life as a human being is not possible without some certain freedoms. The freedom to breathe, the freedom to eat, to move, to speak, to cohabit. The lack of these freedoms spells death, basically. If you can't eat or breathe or speak, you're dead. Human flourishing, though, is not possible without further freedoms. The freedom to choose, to disagree, to create, and to trade. These are the cornerstones of modern liberal civilization. Now, Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, wrote that freedom is the alone or unoriginated birthright of man and belongs to him by force of his humanity. Kant's argument for freedom as a birthright was founded on his metaphysics of morals, which is unrelated to the real world. In the real world, there are no birthrights, only rights that are hard-won and stoutly defended. And that is what we're trying to do here. So my own argument for freedom is based, like those of David Hume, Adam Smith, Jeremy Bentham, J.S. Mill, and F.A. Hayek, are not metaphysical, but empirical and practical. The empirical case for freedom is that freedom made our civilization possible. This is the civilization that has rescued billions of people from poverty and made life on Earth easier than our ancestors could possibly imagine. Now, there are three distinguishing features of what I call liberal civilization. The first is openness. Society is not divided by birth or by force into men, women, masters, slaves, patricians, plebeians, aristocrats and commoners, high caste and low caste. Material equality is unachievable, but in liberal civilization, persons have the legal capacity and the practical opportunities to overcome social, economic, and economic barriers through their own endeavors. The second distinguishing mark of liberal civilization is what economist Deepak Lal called Promethean growth. Past civilizations achieved extensive growth partly through conquest. Extensive growth, as economists understand it, is the increase of output by increase of input. Promethean growth is intensive. Typically, it represents increased output from existing or lower input. Agriculture provides a classic illustration of this. In traditional agriculture, food production was increased by cultivating more land. When all the cultivable land is tilled, there is no further capacity for expansion of agriculture. This model of growth persuaded George Malthus to predict in 1798 that population growth will eventually outpace agricultural growth and lead to human catastrophe. It did not happen because agriculture, by achieving intensive growth, outpaced the population. Now, as I said, I'm not making a metaphysical case for freedom, but a practical one. And there are two reasons, basically, why I think freedom is indispensable to this kind of civilization. Civilization is built on knowledge. There are two kinds of knowledge of particular importance to our civilization. One kind is scientific knowledge, by which I include knowledge of how the world works and how to do things. The other kind of knowledge is peculiar to time and place. The philosopher Karl Popper demonstrated that scientific knowledge grows not by beliefs and essences, but by bold conjectures and rigorous attempts at refutation. And just to quote him, he said that science is valued for its liberating influence as one of the greatest of the forces that make for human freedom. Now, I would say conversely, science is impossible without human freedom. Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, and Darwin advanced science in defiance of authority and public opinion. Galileo paid a heavy price, as you know, for his views. It was a sin in Galileo's time to question the belief that the earth was the center of the universe. If the censors had prevailed, there would be no distance telephone calls today, no radio, no TV, not to mention spacecraft, electronic commerce, and the social media such as Facebook and Twitter. There would also not be the technology that has saved millions of people from death by disease and starvation. Today we are told that the science concerning anthropogenic climate change is settled. Science by definition is never settled. In Australia, where research is almost wholly funded by government, projects that question the science, the economics and law concerning climate policy are starved of resources. I can imagine Galileo stirring in his grave. Today we are also told that we must not criticize a religion, even a religion that claims to be the one right way to organize society and the behavior of its members. Such a religion is a theory about the good life and the kind of social order that we all ought to have. Criticism of this theory will almost certainly offend the faithful, just as the theories of Galileo, Copernicus, Newton, and Darwin offended some Christians in the past. There is another kind of knowledge indispensable to a liberal civilization. It is a knowledge that is dispersed among millions of persons about which no government or economic planner can be in command. It is a knowledge peculiar to time and place, of individual preferences, and of the value that persons attach to things. As Friedrich Hayek explained in his classic essay, The Use of Knowledge in Society, the harnessing of this kind of knowledge is the principal problem that a rational economic order must solve. The problem draws different conclusions or responses. The pretense of knowledge is one response. Government claims to know what citizens need, want, prefer, and value. Therefore, government can rationally allocate burdens and benefits to make everyone happy. In other words, the problem can be mathematically solved by central planning. The other approach is what Adam Smith revealed 3 centuries ago in an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. Let the planning be done by each individual in the pursuit of their own ends. Allow them to use the information that they alone possess to improve their lives through voluntary exchange. Prices will be fixed and resources directed not by a central planner, but by the daily choices of individuals. It is this system of exchange that created the wealth that we now take for granted. Freedom is the indispensable basis of this system. The freedom to choose, to express, to trade, and to hold property. As Hayek wrote in The Constitution of Liberty, the case for individual freedom rests chiefly on the recognition of the inevitable and universal ignorance of all of us concerning a great many of the factors on which the achievement of our ends and welfare depend. Now, I want to touch on a very important question. The relationship between rights and freedom. They're not the same thing. There are rights that support and protect freedom, and there are rights that derogate and threaten freedom. Now, there are obviously two kinds of freedom: our physical freedom to do what we want to do, jump, run, breathe, eat. And there is, of course, the freedom from coercion by others, including government. Now, there are two kinds of rights. The rights derived from rules of conduct and rights to benefits created by legislation. The first kind of right has ancient roots. They're based on customary rules of conduct that grew insensibly out of the experience and became the common law of the land. These are the rules that made social life possible. As Hayek pointed out, they're general and independent and impersonal. Now, we know these laws, these rights, as rights under the laws concerning crime, concerning tort, concerning contract. Now, what is the other kind of right? The second kind of right consists of the rights to specific benefits that can only be created by deliberate legislative acts. General rules of conduct cannot assure specific material outcomes. Contract law does not guarantee that all parties will always profit from a contract. Criminal law protects life, liberty, and property, but what you make of your life and your assets depends on your own choices, actions, and circumstances. In contrast, legislation can make direct transfers to rearrange economic relations between parties. Parliament may directly create benefits by creating tax exemptions, granting subsidies to industry, or pensions of various sorts. It can, through tribunals, fix wages, and modify private contracts, and so on and so forth. We all know about that. Now, the final part of my paper but you notice that this kind of rights created by legislation to grant specific benefits to particular sections of the community can only be done by derogating from those other rights that we have based in general rules of conduct. Now, the last couple of minutes, I want to focus on another issue. There are true arguments for limiting freedom, and there are false arguments for limiting freedom. The true argument for limiting freedom is that absolute freedom is impossible. If you have freedom to drive on the streets in any way we wish, no one will have the freedom to drive. This kind of limitation is inherent in the idea of freedom in society. The traffic rules, by limiting my freedom to act irresponsibly, enhances the freedom of all. That's the true argument for limiting freedom. What is a false argument? It goes something like this. Legal freedom is valueless to a person who lacks the means to partake of it. Therefore, we can only grant freedom to them by providing material benefits. There are countless lawful aspirations that are beyond the reach of most individuals. A person can hardly complain about the inability to enjoy the finer things in life. But what about the basic resources that allow a person to live in safety and in dignity? If a person does not have the means to buy food, shelter, and other necessities of life, the person's liberty, though legally intact, may seem hollow. How does a liberal civilization address this material impediment to the enjoyment of life and liberty and dignity? It is by expanding freedom. The greatest human catastrophes tend to happen in countries where people are unfree. Now, India coped with natural disasters much better than Africa. India is not rich by Western standards. Its democracy is imperfect, and its governments are ponderous. Yet, India has certain priceless assets that the African nations lacked. India has a parliamentary democracy and a legal system that by and large secure individual freedom. The Indian constitution also has established a common market within which goods can move, however laboriously, to places where they are most in need. It was not always so. It is not always so. The Bengal famine of 1770 cost the lives of 10 million people. 10 million people died in that of starvation. The country at the time was governed by the British East India Company, the private company, which was responsible only to its shareholders. The pursuit of profits through predatory taxation of crops and the monopolization of the grain trade contributed heavily to the onset of the famine. My concluding point is that the material conditions necessary to enjoy freedom grow with freedom itself. Freedom creates its own means of enjoyment. Two respected annual surveys of economic freedom show a persistent correlation between freedom and prosperity. Freedom, they are the Index of Economic Freedom published by Heritage and the Economic Freedom of the World report published by Fraser Institute. Even the most affluent societies, even in the most affluent societies, there are persons who need material assistance because of factors such as age, disability, and other personal misfortune. However, the society's capacity to provide a generalized security, social safety net is enhanced not by limiting freedom, but by its enlargement. Thank you very much.